Welcome to the channel. We will begin part 2 of our reading of Cornelis Venema's essay on One Kingdom or Two. And in part 2 of this series, we will look at his evaluation of the Two Kingdoms paradigm under section 3. Our treatment of the main features of the Two Kingdoms paradigm confirms that it represents a comprehensive approach to the difficult question of the Christian's calling in culture and society. It also represents an approach that diverges considerably from the neo-Calvinist paradigm, which views the relation between creation and redemption in far more integrated terms. The claims of the Two Kingdoms perspective are far-reaching and constitute an inescapable challenge to Reformed Christians who wish to be responsibly obedient in their life before God and the world in this period between Christ's first and second comings. In my evaluation of the Two Kingdoms perspective, I will begin with some observations about aspects of this approach that are commendable. In some respects, the Two Kingdoms view offers a corrective to the excesses of some versions of the neo-Calvinist view. If the adage is true that iron sharpens iron, there are features of the Two Kingdoms paradigm that challenge neo-Calvinists to consider whether certain aspects of their view are in need of refinement. The commendable features of the Two Kingdoms paradigm that I will identify represent a modest attempt to acknowledge whether such further refinement of neo-Calvinism may be desirable. Subsequent to my identification of these commendable features of the Two Kingdoms paradigm, I will identify a number of its troublesome features. The presence of these troublesome features in the Two Kingdoms paradigm causes me to demur finally from embracing it as a more biblically satisfying and coherent view of the Christian's calling in the world. The burden of my comments regarding these troublesome features will be that the Two Kingdoms perspective is not as biblical or as beneficial in terms of its implications as its proponents suggest. 3.1. Commendable features. That the Two Kingdoms paradigm endeavors to address the difficult question of the Christian's calling in society and culture is itself commendable. The tendency within many evangelical and Reformed churches in more recent history is to narrow the claims of the gospel and the implications of the Christian life or Christian faith for public life. In the Western European and North American context, a long history of secularization has occurred, dating back roughly to the time of the 18th century Enlightenment. Secularization can have at least two meanings. In one sense, secularization may simply refer to the process whereby the institutional church has lost its influence and sway in many areas of public life. The older Constantinian alliance between church and state has been deconstructed, and all citizens of the civil community are permitted a diversity of confessional commitments and practices that are in accord with them. But in another sense, secularization can also mean that human society is thoroughly desacralized, and the Christian faith and any other competing religious faith is banished from the public square altogether. In many secularized Western nations, the Christian faith is regarded as a purely private matter, which has no stake or interest in the broader affairs of human society and culture. Christians may worship God on Sunday and experience communion with God within the precincts of their private prayer closet, but they may not allow their religious convictions to intrude into the arenas of public life, politics, and culture. In a significant way, the Two Kingdoms perspective does not wish to divorce the Christian faith from meaningful engagement with the world, nor does the Two Kingdoms view want to deny that the biblical worldview encompasses an interest in the calling of believers in the world as well as in the church. Though the Two Kingdoms paradigm offers a rigorously dualistic conception of how believers are to fulfill their calling before God in the respective realms of the common and the redemptive kingdoms, it nonetheless aims to offer a comprehensive account of how the full range of the activities of believers relate to biblical teaching. For the clear way in which the Two Kingdoms perspective engages the questions of Christianity and culture, it deserves the attention of all Reformed believers who take seriously their calling to serve God and neighbor in every area of human life and culture. In addition to the broad service that the Two Kingdoms paradigm serves in keeping the question of Christ and culture alive among contemporary Christian believers, there are several positive features of this paradigm that require special notice. 3.2. The distinctive calling and competence of the church. One of the most attractive emphases of the Two Kingdoms approach is its insistence that the church remain true to its unique calling to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. No other human institution has the calling or the competence which follows from Christ's promise to accompany the gospel with the power of Christ's Spirit to proclaim the unsearchable riches of God's grace toward fallen sinners. By virtue of Christ's commission, it is the special task of the church to disciple the nations by means of resolute preaching of the biblical gospel, the administration of the sacraments that accompany the word, and to exercise faithful discipline, admitting into the fellowship of Christ all who repent and believe, while excluding all who remain impenitent and unbelieving. Proponents of the two kingdoms paradigm are undoubtedly justified in their worry that the church not be distracted from this calling by a preoccupation with penultimate affairs. They are likewise on the right track in their resolution to preserve the church's singular focus upon its proper calling, particularly in the face of the temptation to enter areas of human life and culture that lie outside of the church's special competence. When the gospel of Jesus Christ is directly linked to a specific political agenda or program, whether the moral majority, the platform of a major political party, a particular political figure, economic system, or particular cultural agenda, the church unnecessarily puts at risk its reputation as the steward of Christ's gospel to the nations. In the history of the church, it is not difficult to find illustrations of the church's abandonment of its special commission for the sake of meddling in matters that lie outside of its particular competence. Nor is it difficult to find instances where the church and its members confused loyalty to Christ and the gospel with loyalty to some earthly authority, nation, or program for societal improvement or cultural transformation. For example, throughout the history of the church during the Middle Ages, an ongoing struggle took place between the church and the civil authorities regarding their relative authority and interrelationship. During the struggle, the church often asserted its right to exercise direct oversight in the affairs of the civil order. This spiritual sword wielded by the church was viewed as a higher and all-inclusive authority, including the temporal sword wielded by the magistrate or civil authority. During the Nazi era in Germany during the 20th century, some segments of the church were captivated by what was known as the German Christian movement, which identified the emergence of the Third Reich under Hitler with God's particular purpose at that moment in history. Civil religion, which encourages an exaggerated patriotism that views a specific nation as the preeminent object of God's favor, also deprives the church of its freedom to preach the gospel unfettered by competing political loyalties. Within the circle of progressive mainline churches, the temptation during the last 2 centuries to conflate the gospel with progressive programs of social and economic justice has often been irresistible. A similar failure to remain true to its proper mission is evident when the church makes pronouncements regarding contemporary issues in society and culture that lie outside of its competence. There is a danger, of course, that attends this emphasis of the two kingdoms paradigm. For it is one thing to emphasize the special calling and competence of the church to preach the gospel, but it is quite another thing to say that the gospel does not speak, whether directly or indirectly, to all of life. The difficult challenge for the church is its obligation to preserve the integrity of the gospel without denying the implications of the gospel for service to God in all areas of life in His world. I will have occasion to return to this point in what follows, but it is possible to separate the redemptive message of the gospel, which the church is called to proclaim, from the social, economic, political, and cultural implications of the gospel. Just as the church may err in speaking where it is not called to speak or pronouncing in areas outside of its competence, so the church may err and has erred in failing to address social and cultural sins that are evident in contemporary society and culture. Though this is not the place to sort out the complex issues of what historically Presbyterians in North America have termed the spirituality of the church, there's undoubtedly a doctrine of spirituality that mutes the gospel's testimony to the world by declaring illegitimate any social or moral pronouncements by the church. The church must remain true to its special calling to preach the gospel, but in doing so, the church must recognize that it is the gospel of Christ's kingdom which addresses all of life in God's world. 3.3. The distinctive calling and competence of the state. Two kingdoms proponents are fond of arguing that their position is simply the expression of the prevailing position of the Reformed churches throughout their history. Perhaps the one place where this claim has some merit is the difficult issue of the relative authority and calling of the church and the state. While there is considerable diversity on this issue in the Reformed tradition, John Calvin, who is generally recognized to be the most influential theologian in the formation of Reformed theology, articulated his doctrine of Christ's twofold government, or duplex regime, or jurisdiction, primarily to resolve the problem of the relation between ecclesiastical and civil authorities. For Calvin, the twofold government of Christ articulates the way Christ governs his church spiritually by his Spirit and Word on the one hand, and the way Christ governs the civil community by the civil magistrate with the power of the sword on the other. In Calvin's doctrine of Christ's twofold rule in the church and state, two contrary impulses are resisted. The state or civil magistrate who serves at Christ's behest and ministers his authority through the power of the sword and the administration of justice may not usurp the special task that Christ has given to the church. The civil magistrate is not directly responsible for the calling to preach the gospel, administer the sacraments, and exercise church discipline. While the civil magistrate ought to exercise its authority in a way that promotes the cause of Christ's kingdom and church, the civil magistrate has no right to intrude into the proper affairs of the church. Calvin was in this respect opposed to what is known as an Erastian church polity, where the state has direct authority over the church. However, Calvin was also anxious to preserve a proper respect for and subjection to the civil magistrate as a servant of Christ. Against the Anabaptist repudiation of the legitimate authority of the civil magistrate, Calvin insisted that the civil magistrate governs all members of the civil community in accordance with its peculiar calling or office. When Calvin speaks of a twofold government, therefore, he does not speak so much of two different realms or kingdoms. Calvin's language of twofold government is intended to distinguish the different manner in which Christ rules over his people and the civil community. While the rule of Christ within the civil arena is external and includes the coercive power of the sword to maintain order and punish lawbreakers, the rule of Christ within the ecclesiastical arena is spiritual and includes the work of the Spirit in binding the hearts of believers to free and grateful obedience. Broadly conceived, Calvin's doctrine of the twofold government of Christ in church and state roughly corresponds to the traditional distinction between the second or civil use of the law of God and the third use of the law as a rule of gratitude. While Calvin's view of Christ's twofold government is more complicated than my simple summary might imply, his distinction between the respective callings and corresponding limits of authority that belong to church and state is a commonplace in the history of Reformed theology. To the extent that the two kingdoms paradigm distinguishes between Christ's spiritual rule over his people and the civil magistrate's rule over the civil community, it is simply affirming what Reformed theologians have generally affirmed. When two kingdoms advocates speak of the Reformed doctrine of the two kingdoms, they speak justifiably of a common distinction between what Orthodox Reformed theology called the Christ kingdom of grace, the regnum gratiae, and his kingdom of power, regnum potentiae. Christ spiritually rules over his people through the power of his Spirit and Word, regenerating and recreating them after the image of Christ. However, Christ also rules in power over all things, including over those who may not inwardly submit to his kingship. To the degree that the two kingdoms doctrine aims to affirm only this traditional Reformed distinction between the two ways Christ exercises his dominion in history prior to the consummation at his coming, it has title to the claim of being Reformed. 3.4. A modest and unpretentious view of the Christian's calling in the world. A recurring theme in the advocacy of the two kingdoms paradigm is the claim that neo-Calvinism tends to be overreaching in its understanding of the Christian's task in society and culture. Theologically expressed, neo-Calvinism has an over-realized eschatology which expects that more can be accomplished by Christian believers in the public square than is warranted. In the scriptural descriptions of the status of believers in this present age before the return of Christ, believers are viewed as pilgrims and aliens in relation to the world. These descriptions do not lend encouragement to the idea that believers will be successful in transforming human life and culture before Christ returns. When neo-Calvinism speaks of the need to redeem human culture and society under the lordship of Jesus Christ, advocates of the two kingdoms paradigm respond by emphasizing the sufficiency of Christ's work as Redeemer. Christians should not view their obedience as in any way supplementing or completing the work of Christ. Nor is it proper for Christians to assume responsibility for an enterprise, the renewal of human life and culture, which lies beyond their reach in this world. When neo-Calvinists speak of the Christian's calling to redeem politics, economics, family life, culture, art, the sciences, and so on, they suggest that the work of Christ is somehow incomplete. Furthermore, the neo-Calvinist paradigm burdens believers with an impossible assignment, namely the obligation to pursue a distinctively Christian approach to matters that belong to the common kingdom. Because the tasks of the common kingdom are in the nature of the case not distinctive to Christians, there is no obvious or objective difference in the way they are carried out by believers and non-believers. Though not all neo-Calvinists are liable to the charge of triumphalism, there are some postmillennialists and reconstructionists who may lend credence to these concerns of two kingdoms protagonists. It is quite possible to view the activity of Christians in society and culture in a manner that exaggerates their accomplishments or fails to reckon adequately with the limitations that will always accompany Christian conduct in the present age. In some circumstances, Christian believers are hardly in a position to exercise significant influence in the public square. In the increasingly secular environment of the Christian church in North America, there is little room for pressing the claims of Christ in the public domain. In many instances, pursuing a distinctively Christian agenda in the public square will provoke considerable hostility and resistance. Though Christians in North America are not yet subject to the kinds of overt persecution and oppression that fellow believers experience in many parts of the world, the likelihood of growing opposition to the promotion of Christian standards of conduct in society and culture is great. There are aspects of the two kingdoms paradigm, particularly the criticism of exaggerated claims for Christian obedience or the effectiveness of Christian witness in the public arena, that offer a cautionary note against any pretension or immodesty on the part of believers in the efforts to serve Christ in public life and culture. Such pretentiousness and immodesty does not necessarily belong to the neo-Calvinist paradigm, but it undoubtedly has occasionally infected the rhetoric and the actions of some proponents of a transformative approach to Christianity and culture. 3.5. Natural law and the common kingdom. One of the complaints of the two kingdoms paradigm against the emphases of neo-Calvinism is that the latter paradigm unduly exaggerates the antithesis that obtains between believers and non-believers. When neo-Calvinists insist upon a distinctively Christian form of obedience all of life, even in the affairs of the common kingdom, insufficient attention is given to the way God maintains the created order by his providence and orders human life by his natural law. Within the common kingdom, human beings, however sinful and incapable of obtaining salvation by their own obedience, are still the beneficiaries of God's common grace, which sustains human life, restrains the extent of human rebellion and wickedness, and grants some ability to apprehend God's will for the created order without the aid of special revelation. The natural law of God, which is objectively available and capable of being apprehended by all human beings who bear God's image, is a sufficient guide for human life and culture in the common kingdom. The relative justice of civil government, the advance in knowledge among the various sciences, marriage and family life, the pursuit of the arts, and the like. In these aspects of the common kingdom, believers and unbelievers are able to work together in peaceful coexistence. Indeed, in many of these aspects of the common kingdom, think of the sciences of mathematics, physics, and biochemistry, for example, non-believers are often able to surpass believers in knowledge and achievement. According to the two kingdoms paradigm, the excellence of the accomplishments of non-believers is due to the working of God's common grace and the apprehension of the natural law within the common kingdom. The neo-Calvinist paradigm is unable to account for this due to its exaggerated emphasis upon the antithesis that cuts through all aspects of human life and culture. Whereas neo-Calvinism is required to deny the excellence of the artifacts of human culture, at least those produced by non-believers, the two kingdoms view is able to account for them. Though these excellent fruits of human culture have no redemptive value and will not pass over into the world to come, they are genuine and undeniable proofs of the reality of the common kingdom. Though I will offer some criticisms of these claims of the two kingdoms paradigm in what follows, here I would simply observe that there is a moment of truth in them. It is certainly possible to overstate the truth of the antithesis between faith and unbelief. For example, some neo-Calvinists might choose to affirm the truth of the antithesis between faith and unbelief, but deny the working of God's common grace in the restraint of human sin and rebellion. Though this is not the classic position of neo-Calvinism, which is known and sometimes criticized for its doctrine of common grace, it is certainly possible to emphasize the antithesis in such a way as to deny that unbelievers can do anything that is even relatively righteous or good in any area of life. It is also possible to deny the objective reality of God's natural law, as well as any possibility of a limited discernment of God's moral will upon its basis. Among neo-Orthodox Reformed theologians influenced by Karl Barth, this is indeed the case. But this, too, is not the common position among neo-Calvinists, who typically affirm both the doctrines of the antithesis and of common grace. Neo-Calvinists also typically affirm the reality of God's natural law, though they often use the terminology of order or structure of creation under God's law, rather than, quote, natural law. The significant point to note here is that the two kingdoms paradigm challenges the neo-Calvinists to account for commonality between believers and non-believers where it exists. Unless neo-Calvinists can offer a viable account of genuine commonality between believers and unbelievers in some aspects of human life and society and culture, they are in the unenviable position of seemingly denying the obvious. To use but one trivial example, better to have an unbelieving brain surgeon who's sufficiently knowledgeable and skilled in his field than to have a believing brain surgeon whose intentions are good, but whose knowledge and skill are not sufficient to the task. Whether in the academy, the art gallery, literature, medicine, social relations, economic development, technological innovation, political structures, and the like, There are many accomplishments by believers and non-believers alike in society and culture that are valuable and good. These accomplishments should be acknowledged and able to be explained. While I am convinced that the challenge of the two kingdoms paradigm at this point can be met within the framework of the neo-Calvinist paradigm, it is no doubt true that it cannot be met easily by neo-Calvinists who repudiate altogether the doctrines of common grace and natural law.